Hello everyone, my name is Eryk Walczak and I'm going to talk to you about a project on banking regulation, on measuring complexity in banking regulation. So this is a joint project conducted by myself and several of my colleagues, Zahita Machari, James Brooks, Nick Gabrino and Rajan Patel. And let me just start with saying that the views in this presentation are mine and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bank of England or its policy committees. So this talk is going to focus on our research, which was published last year as a staff working paper. It's publicly available, and I'm going to expand on these topics. I'm going to talk you through that in detail. So how we can measure complexity in banking regulation. So let me start by explaining the reasons for running this particular study. So there are several costs of regulation: opportunity costs, compliance costs, cognitive costs. And when talking about opportunity costs, you can think about restriction on behavior. So what are the limits on leverage by capital requirements? We talk about compliance costs. You might have some. You might need to demonstrate that restrictions are met. For example, costs of reporting, and there are some cognitive costs. So costs which people that read regulations need to bear, costs that one needs to bear when understanding regulation, when reading the rules. And this particular project focuses on the last cost, on cognitive costs. So how complexity, we're going to talk about how complexity is related to cognitive costs of regulation. So in order to do that, we conduct textual and network analysis of rules. And let me first talk about data. So data we used here is rules, so regulations which were acquired from different materials, from websites, from PDFs, and so on. What's new is that we actually created this data set. So it's the first time this data set was used. And data on regulatory cost is scarce, but texts are readily available. Texts of regulations are publicly available, and that's what we used here. And we use natural language processing to analyze large texts as data. And we use several measures. So measures of cognitive costs of processing texts, and these measures come from psycholinguistics and computational linguistics. So the psycholinguistic aspect of this measure focus on how people process language. So what are the concepts, how many concepts there are, what are the operations that reader needs to actually process, and computational linguistics provide us measures to capture language processing costs. So we want to go beyond just the length, and we focus also on other measures. I'm going to explain measures in details on the next slides. So in this paper, I'm going to talk about post-crisis change in textual complexity. So as I mentioned previously, originally complexity of regulation was measured mostly by just by the length. So that is something that we did here as well. So as you can see on this plot, in 2007, so before the great financial crisis, regulations were around 400,000 words long. But after the crisis, 10 years later, in 2017, the regulations became much longer. So we went to over 600, almost 700,000 words. And the reason for that is that regulations that were previously external to the rule book now were brought into the one set of rules, and also new rules were created, rules that made the regulations tighter, so better rules that cover aspects that were not covered previously. So so we looked at here at the volume, so that's what I just mentioned, but also at sources. So some EU rules became directly binding, and also were added to this set of rules. So as you can see here, total volume of regulations increased. And let me just briefly start with highlighting the results that we found in this study. So there are 4 facts on textual complexity of post-crisis reforms. So the first one is that there's a tighter core which emerges in the network of cross-references, and this core is centered around CRR. CRR stands for Capital Requirement Regulations. Also, there is a legal style which limits complexity of language in individual rules. So the style is fairly constant, and it shows that rules are written in a very similar way, individual rules. We also know that at least a third of rules contain vague terms, so terms like adequate, which require substantial interpretation. And we also validated our measure using EBA, European Banking Authorities, Q&As, and we also ran a case study on definition of capital. So here's the agenda for the talk. So I'm going to start with talk about data. So the objectives for this data were threefold. So we wanted to have a data set that's comprehensive for post-crisis 2017, and a data set that captures all prudential regulation that applies directly to UK banks, and also to capture supporting guidance. We wanted to have this data set which is comparable pre and post crisis. So in 2007 versus 2017, we wanted to capture equivalent scope of regulation to make comparison that makes sense. And we also wanted to create a data set that will facilitate network analysis. So we wanted to capture the connection between different parts of the rulebook. So there are several data sources. So I showed them on the previous slide on the bar chart, but data here was acquired by web scraping, by extracting data, extracting text from PDFs, because regulation has several sources now. So the main source really was web scraping. So we acquired this data from Prudential Regulation Authority's website. This allowed us to create a tabular data in a tidy format. We also extracted data from text from PDF documents, so from supervisory statements. And we also extracted links. So links were extracted by following the mentions of different rules that were used in the text. So for example, on the image that you can see here, there is a rule 4.2 highlighted in yellow, and that shows you that rule that I'm showing you here, rule 1.1, is linking to rule 4.2. So that's a type of linkage that was extracted, and this type of linkage was later used for network analysis. Most of this analysis was automated, but we also got some help from research assistants which checked that our extraction was correct. And code for acquiring this data is publicly available on Bank of England's GitHub code repository, so you can use this data as well and use it for your own purposes. So let me now talk about measures. So we had several measures, so measures of linguistic complexity here. So there are widely used measures, so of like lexical diversity, which show you relative frequency of unique words. We have measures of conditionality, which tells you the relative frequency of conditional statements, ifs and buts. And we also have measure of length, so number of words. And each of these measures cover different cognitive costs. So concepts, operations, so both of them. There are also measures coming from network science, so structural measures, which tell you about how the network of regulation is constructed, is built. So degree, so this is number of direct cross-references to a rule. So whether there is a link between particular rule, tells you whether there is a direct cross-reference. Page rank, which is a chain of cross-references leading to a rule, weighted by their importance. So that's the famous Google algorithm. And both of these measures tell you about centrality. We also use the degree out, so number of direct cross-references from a rule, so coming out of rule. And we also had a reverse PageRank, which is a chain of cross-references starting from a rule. And the last two measures tell about the context of a particular rule. We also had some measures from law, or inspired by legal studies. So vagueness and precision were the ones that we measured. So vagueness was a ratio of very vague terms like reasonable or adequate, which tell you about need for interpretation. We also measured precision, which is a ratio of very precise numerical signs or words. So mentions of particular currency or percentages and so on. So these were the measures that we used in this particular work. And we also wanted to validate whether the measures are sensible, whether they actually can be used, and they measure what we think they use. So in order to do that, we used questions and answers which are posted on EBA's, European Banking Authority's website. So here you can see an example of these questions. And we fitted a model, a rich logistic regression model, which we, on the left-hand side, we essentially had a binary variable 0 or 1, saying whether a question was asked about a particular rule, about a particular CRR article here. And using this model, we validated our measures, and we found that degree, in degree, and PageRank, so the structural measures were highly predictive of the fact that the question will be asked about a particular rule. So central rules were the ones that had more questions asked about them. Also precise rules, and the rules that were a bit longer. So in brief, this these measures allow us to understand post-crisis reforms in regulation. So I'll start with the descriptive table. So we found that the length of the rules changed, number of words, unique words increased, also number of conditional words increased, but also the network became denser, so there were more nodes and more edges, more connections between the rules. So we know now that post-reform regulation is longer, contains more concepts and more operations, and there are more links between the rules. So here you can see some plots that show you how different deciles changed on length, lexical diversity, and conditionality. So essentially, the most complex rules became even more complex. So legal style here ensures that linguistic complexity is contained in these small pockets of complexity. And I think you can see the changing complexity very well on this chart here. So in 2007, network was much smaller and had one source, so just data regulations coming from the rulebook. Whereas in 2017, you can see this core, which is concentrated in capital requirement regulations in yellow, but there are also different sources, and the capital regulations are central to the network, and also the network became much larger, and the structure is just tightly connected to rules around capital requirements. But also there is a periphery of rules which are a bit isolated. So you can see essentially here that this network centrality and context changing, which resulted in highly interconnected core post-crisis. So this particular research can lead to or can help in understanding whether certain rules can be made machine readable. So there is a wide so there are quite a few research projects going on around this topic, and also growing interest in topic of machine readability. So traditional solution to regulatory complexity was simplification, However, some might argue that regtech means that simplification is no longer necessary, because what is difficult for humans is not necessarily difficult for machines. However, law requires interpretation and supervision requires discretion. So not every rule can be automated, because there are some vague terms, or sometimes interpretation is required and discretion is required. So we wanted to study to what extent there is a occurrence of vague concepts or specific concepts in rules. So we also measured this occurrence of vague or precise terms, and we demonstrated here. We measured that vague terms are common, so specific numerical values are not, and they are in relative decline post-crisis. And this allows us to identify rules which can be successfully automated, or we think that this might be a way in that direction. So if we plot rules which are vague and rules which are conditional, have relative conditionality which is high, we can find different elements, different types of rules. So for example, here, rules which are vague and have low conditionality might require substantial interpretation. However, rules which are on different parts of the spectrum, rules that contain no vague terms, might require relative higher number of cognitive conditional operations. So this way you can actually group your rules into certain. You can group your rules and potentially simplify one group or not. Or this plot can tell you which rules might be simplified if needed. So to conclude, using textual analysis. We used textual analysis to measure post-crisis increasing complexity. We found that larger and more interconnected, the rules are larger and more interconnected. Language of individual rules did not become more complex, and we developed an approach to identify when machine-readable rules could succeed. And we also created a new data set. So thank you very much for listening, and you can contact me using this email, and you can also contact me on Twitter. And please read our working paper, which is publicly available, and you can see, you can just Google it, and here you can see the title. Thank you very much.